If we choose to pass now, can we change our decision after the final grade? Uh, Technically, yes. You have the decision, you have the option to uh, choose the pass or fail up until May 20th. But if you choose to opt out of the exam now, you can't do anything about it afterwards. Long answer question number 43. Let me pull that up. Number 43. If the minimum wage law is eliminated, the poor will be worse off. Okay? And your question is, could you explain a bit of detail? So here's the thing. When I say explain, all these questions that say explain or discuss, etc., I'm leaving them purposely open-ended. I want you to interpret that quote however way you think it makes the most sense, and then I want you to discuss what you think the economic, legal, political implications are of that quote. And again, to get a level 4 or to get a level 3, which is an 80%, you need to tie in the question, tie in your answer to the question to 3 concepts we've discussed in class. And those 3 concepts could be, you can talk about, the supply and demand effects. You can talk about the policy effects. You can talk about the legal effects. You can say, are the poor going to be worse off legally? And then, I don't know, work something in about, I don't know. I don't want to answer the question for you, but just think about these questions very broadly and try to tie in as much content from the course as you can in the limited amount of time that you have. And if you do it in for level 4, I said a masterful way, then you can get a level 4 mark. And if it's a bit disjointed, maybe level 3 or even a level 2. That's right. It's mostly, so these questions are purposely open-ended. There's no objectively right or wrong answer. I'm just asking you to, I'm just testing you to see how you are applying the, the concepts of the course in a logical manner. Because I think the concepts that we went over the course are very logical, and they should give you the tools to answer any of those questions logically. And if you just do this with the concepts, you should be able to get a level 4, or at least a level 3, which is an 80%. What are inferior goods? Okay. So we have normal goods, inferior goods, and luxury goods. A normal good is where there is a situation where as your income goes up, you buy more of that thing. Okay? As your income, well, a normal good is that it's any good that has a normal supply and demand relationship. Okay? Inferior goods, remember we talked about Giffen goods, right? Giffen goods. Those are situations where the demand curve can be upward sloping, right? So it kind of, the demand curve kind of looks like that. And those are things like potatoes, right? So the story is about the potato famine, where even though potatoes were seen as inferior to meat, as the price of potatoes went up, people bought more potatoes relative to meat because they were uh, they got more bang for their buck from the potatoes, right? So the issue with inferior goods are goods that people prefer not to have as their income goes up, but as their income goes down, they will buy more. Okay, so as your normal good, you can think of it as income goes up, you buy more. For inferior, this is if your income decreases, you buy more. And then luxury goods are things like um, jewelry and diamond watches, etc. Whereas the price goes up, you buy more. Demand goes up. Can you outline the main concepts that you'll be looking for in our responses? Are some concepts we learn more important than others? The only concept that's more important um, than others that I combine is that we had 3 different lectures that talked about supply and demand. We had a whole lecture on supply, we had a whole lecture on demand, and then we had we had 2 lectures applying supply and demand together. If you make any reference to supply and demand, that counts as one concept. Does that make sense? Great. Any other questions? So, was there anything else in the course that you thought was confusing? Real GDP and nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is the GDP that's measured in the dollars of the current time, right? So right now you have um, nominal GDP could be this year, I don't know, $100 billion, okay, for Canada. But real GDP is the GDP accounting for inflation. Because remember, GDP is your income per year, and your income, you know that we have with inflation, your income is actually a little bit lower. Your real income is a little bit lower than your nominal income, and your real income is what your income is after adjusting for GDP. What does it mean? What does the term priceless mean? Priceless means uh, different things, right? So you have to be very clear in how you're interpreting priceless. So priceless could mean 2 things. One, 0 price. Okay? That means something that's offered for free officially. So like parking in most malls is doesn't officially have a price, as in you're not this should be monetary price. And then alternatively, impossible to value economically. So parking lots, you can say, even though some places offer zero price parking, you can say that because the market for parking lots includes parking lots that have that are paid for, you can compare the zero price to the non-zero prices, and imagine and calculate what the difference is, and then you can, if you're a business and you're offering free parking, you can count that as a cost, right? So if you say typically people charge, let's say $5 for an hour, that's a lot, but let's say people charge $5 an hour to park in a similar sort of business as a mall, but the mall is offering parking for free. How much money are they losing by offering free parking? So that's one way you can think about it when it comes to things with zero price. Things that are priceless, that are impossible to value economically, that means this is really like a moral judgment, I think. So some people say that the human life is priceless, but we know that there isn't monetary price people put on human lives. There's something called the value VSL, the value of a statistical life. And this is how insurance companies and government agencies, this is how they determine how much money to pay victims of accidents and other things should they lose their life. And if there was a hurricane or something, how do you measure the human cost? And how they come up with this is a complicated formula, but one way they do this is estimating your future income. And your future income, they say, is equivalent to your future contribution to GDP or whatever you want. And so the value of your life would have been all the income you would have earned over the course of your life. So it's higher for younger people, especially children, and it's much lower for older people, especially the retired, the sick, etc. For the multiple choice portion of the exam, are the questions based on the readings? Would it be worth it to go over all the readings? Yeah. So the questions from the multiple choice portions are from all the readings that you've done, right? So it's all the same quizzes that you've been doing throughout the semester. Freedom from contract and freedom to contract. So freedom to contract means the ability to make contractual agreements with other consenting adults. That's freedom to contract. Freedom from contract is the ability to say no to any offer made to you for a contract. So freedom to contract means if this comes up in a lot of ethical questions, where you have the situation people usually like to bring up is prostitution or drug dealing, which are illegal activities. And some people, especially libertarians, say that there should be a freedom to contract between a drug seller and a drug buyer, whereas the government comes in and says it's illegal to make contracts regarding cocaine or heroin or whatever you want. Freedom from contract is the opposite, where you have the right to refuse people's offers to do business with you. And for example, in healthcare, government says that if you are a doctor, you're not allowed to, it's illegal for you to refuse service to anyone. So they don't have the freedom from contract that again, libertarians really push for. Question, is the multiple choice based on the readings and the written questions are based on the lectures? No, so everything is based on the readings. For the written, the long answer questions, if you can connect it to 3 concepts from the readings, plus a concept that we discussed in a lecture but wasn't in a reading, you can do that, and you do it masterfully, you can get a level 4. right? So if you look at the rubric again for the long answer questions, for levels 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, I say you have to tie to the concepts from the readings. And the lectures mostly drew from the readings, the concepts from the readings, and then I try to tie it in. But occasionally I talked about some things that weren't in the readings. For example, Arrow's impossibility theorem. That wasn't in any of the readings, but we did a little experiment talking about Arrow's impossibility theorem. And so if you can work that into an answer, and you've mentioned 3 other concepts that are mentioned in the readings, then you can get a level 4. But it doesn't have to be a lecture. If it's something else you've read outside of the class, and you can tie that in, that's economics related or policy related or legally related, then you can also get a level 4 that way. Any other questions related to economics, policy, law? What are stakeholders? Good question. So we have shareholders and we have stakeholders. So shareholders are people who own legally a portion of a company. Okay? So when you go buy a shareholder is the same word as stockholder. So we have shareholder. This is the same as a stockholder or owner. So these are people who legally own, or have legal ownership claims into a company. Stakeholders are something broader. Stakeholders involve the stockholders or the shareholders and other people who are impacted by the company's decisions. This typically means their employees, their contractors, their customers, and sometimes regulators, etc. And stakeholders also come up in policy decisions, where when government is thinking of implementing a new policy, they consult with stakeholders, and those are anyone who could be impacted by a policy, which for example, in housing, when it comes to housing decisions, they will talk to all the neighbors in that neighborhood for a new housing proposal. If there's a new condo tower going to go up, they will bring in all the neighbors to say, how do you feel about this new condo tower going up? Or if there's going to be a new mining plant somewhere that legally previously wasn't allowed for there to be any mining. Once again, they'll bring in stakeholders and say, who are going to be property owners in the nearby area, and say, how do you feel about converting this land into a mine? And they'll take advantage of their decision that way, or take their thoughts into account in their decision-making process. So recession is an economic downfall for the short term, and depression is an economic downfall for over a decade or longer. Recession and depression are not precise words. So you can think of, so there's a folk definition, like a common rule of thumb definition for a recession, which is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. This is a rule of thumb. But it also has to correlate with unemployment, production numbers, and other economic indicators. And then a depression is just a really, really bad recession. That's about it. So we talked about the Great Depression, and we don't talk about really any other depressions in economic history. There was the Great Depression, and then previously there were other panics. Depression used to be an older word for any recession, and then after the Great Depression, they just stopped using it altogether and just started using recessions for any smaller dips in economic activity. So what is game theory? Game theory is a mathematical field that's used in economics as well, which studies strategic behavior from a purely mathematical perspective. So the classic example of game theory is the prisoner's dilemma, where you have two prisoners, and the two prisoners are in separate rooms. And let me just make sure I'm using the right numbers here. Prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so you have two prisoners, prisoner 1 and prisoner 2, and they are each facing jail time. They've both been accused of a crime, and they're facing jail time, but they don't know how much jail time. The police have put them in separate rooms, and they're saying to each prisoner, they say that if you can either snitch or confess. You can confess to a crime, or you can not confess. So each prisoner has the opportunity to confess or not confess. Confess or not confess. And they say, if you confess and your partner confesses, then you'll each get 6 years in prison. If you, prisoner 1, confess and your partner doesn't confess, then you will get, if you, prisoner 1, don't confess and your partner does confess, then you will get 10 years in prison, and your partner gets nothing. So you don't confess, but your partner confesses. So on the left we have P1, on the right we have P2 here. And then the opposite is true. So if for prisoner 2, if prisoner 2 doesn't confess, but prisoner 1 confesses, prisoner 1 gets 0 years, prisoner 2 gets 10 years. But if both of them not confess, they'll each get 1 year in prison. And then if these are, we call these payoffs. Each one of these is a payoff for each prisoner. And then we say, given these payoffs and these possible decisions, can we predict what the prisoners are going to do? And there are many ways of making that prediction. And one method that we talked about in class is called the Nash equilibrium. And the Nash equilibrium says, for each prisoner, look at what imagine that you know what the other prisoner is going to do. So say you're prisoner 1 and you know that prisoner 2 is going to confess. So if you know prisoner 2 is going to confess and you're prisoner 1, you figure out what's going to be your best strategy if prisoner 1 is going to confess. So prisoner 1 confesses, prisoner 2 confesses, your options are either negative 6 years in prison or negative 10 years in prison. And remember, for prisoner 1, the number on the left is their outcome, their payoff. And we say that if prisoner 2 confesses, their best strategy is to confess as well. And we draw a little circle around them. And now we say, okay, what if prisoner 2, we know for a fact, isn't going to confess? So if they don't confess, my opportunities are, my payoffs are 0 as prisoner 1, or -1. And so in this case, also, it's in my best interest to confess. So I draw a little circle around that. And now we do it for prisoner's 2 point of view. So for prisoner 2, if he knows, prisoner 1 is going to confess for sure. What's prisoner 2's optimal strategy? It's to confess as well. Fewer years in prison. And then we do the same thing over here. If prisoner 1 for sure isn't going to confess, what's prisoner 2's best strategy? Once again, is to confess. And then once we've done that for every player, we look and see if there are any situations where both players have chosen the same strategy. And we see here, confess, confess is the Nash equilibrium, which is how they're going to, we can predict that's how they're going to behave. They're going to both confess, even though if they both not confess, they'll both be better off. But because of how the game is set up, they're both going to choose to confess. But Nash equilibrium isn't the only way of approaching these sorts of approaching game theory. There's also, I talked about backwards induction, which is if decisions are made sequentially. So this is what we call a one-shot game. So the prisoner's dilemma is a one-shot game. There's also sequential games as well, sequential games, and those are more complicated. But sequential games is you make a decision and then the other player sees your decision and then makes a decision based on you. And then in sequential games, that's when you can punish players who cheat or punish players who make bad decisions, etc., or reward players who make good decisions. And in sequential games, the decision-making process gets way more complicated. So let's move on. I've heard of rebound recessions, V-shaped recessions, U and L-shaped recessions. What are the what are the factors impacting them? So what our friend here is asking is if you have, this is time and this is GDP. So you can say GDP was growing and now we have a recession. So this is our point of recession. So at this point is recession. How is the economy going to rebound? There are multiple ways. A V-shaped recovery is just like it sounds. The economy just comes back up with the same at the same rates as it came back down almost, and it looks like a V, and then it keeps going up like it used to. A L-shaped recovery is, well, let's talk about a U-shaped recovery. So it comes down and then it kind of stays stagnant for a while and then it goes back up. So this is, it stays down for a longer period and it goes back up still sharply, but it stays flat for a long time at the bottom. So this kind of looks like a U. So we call that a U-shaped recovery before it goes back up normally again. And then there's an L-shaped recovery which comes down and then just stays down for a very long time and it doesn't go back up. So what impacts the shape of a recovery is the policies implemented after a recession. So if you make it, the harder you make it to get business back to normal, the longer this recession is going to stay at a low GDP level. And this was an example of this was this U-shaped recession. You can think of this as the Great Depression. So Great Depression. So this period was like 10 years, right? These L-shaped recessions, these are countries that have that used to be rich or used to be okay, doing okay, and then they have some sort of horrible coup, and then they are in a permanent low position of GDP. And you can think of North Korea as one example here. So they had their coup in the 50s, and then economic activity hasn't gone up that much since the 1950s. And we talked about looking at measuring their economic activity from space using the lights they turn on at night, etc., and other measures that show that North Korea, for example, has stayed very poor for a very long period of time. And a V-shaped recession, there's something called the 1920 recession. So you can Google that yourself, but this was a very sharp period of recession, and then a very quick, sharp return to normal economic activity. What was government policy like in this time? Not only did the Fed in the United States, they increased interest rates. The government also cut back spending. You can read more about the history of the 1920 recession there, but it's not talked about very often, and I think it's a missed opportunity for learning. If they both confess, they both face jail time. Yes, back into this situation, yeah. In this situation, if they both confess, they both go to jail for 6 years. If they both don't confess, they both go to jail for 1 year, because they were. The story is the police had enough to charge them for something, and then they said, if you confess but your partner doesn't confess, we won't charge you with that thing. So you won't go to jail at all. Is price elasticity always based on demand? No. So we have a price elasticity. Well, okay. So we have a price elasticity of demand. Mathematically, you can have price elasticities based on supply as well. There's actually a little bit of debate whether that's possible. The textbook does calculate price elasticity of supply. So that's the first thing. There is such a thing as price elasticity of supply. It's the same calculation. You're just taking quantity supplied in your mathematics in your formula instead of quantity demanded. And for price elasticity of demand, it's always going to be negative. What are the strategies of getting out of a recession? So this is a big field of debate in economics on how to get out of recessions, what to do once there is a recession. And I mentioned John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman in my economic growth and the business cycle lecture. And the Keynesian response, so there was a guy named Keynes, and people who follow Keynes's prescriptions are called Keynesians. So the Keynesian response is to increase government spending. So they view as a recession. So Keynesians view as a recession as a decrease in GDP. So they say a recession is a decrease in GDP. So how do we get GDP to go back up? Well, we know GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX. And we said that animal spirits cause people to stop spending less on consumption and investments because of animal spirits, some random psychological phenomenon. So the wise, rational people in the government should increase government spending to get GDP back up, and that'll make people better off. That's the Keynesian solution. The monetarist solution, this was based on Friedman as the most famous guy. They say that the government should print more money. Okay? So the reason for that is complicated, but they say that recessions are caused by insufficient supply of money. And so the solution should be to increase the supply of money. And finally, we talked about the Austrians, and that was Hayek and Mises. And they say that recessions are caused by too much money in the first place because of an increase in the supply of money. So that was too much money printing, and so the solution is to stop money printing and to sort of reverse actually money printing in order to get the economy back onto sustainable growth. So those are the three most common proposals for getting out of recessions. But among these three, this Keynesian proposal is the most popular among governments and politicians. This is by far the most popular. Central bankers try to do a sort of Friedmanite, monetarist sort of solution. And so this is, governments do this, central banks do this, and eventually you end up with a combined sort of response. So since the government is spending so much right now for bailouts and medical supplies, are we looking at a U-shaped recovery, or is it possible to obtain a V-shaped? Well, you got to look at it. It fell really sharply, and part of the reason the GDP fell so sharply is because it's been made effectively illegal to leave your house for a very large portion of the population. And insofar as it's illegal to leave your house, we should expect GDP to remain low for an extended period of time. Once people are allowed to leave their homes, then we should see a very sharp increase in economic activity. Will it be as sharp as the initial decline was? Probably not, because we've been locked up for so long, figuring out now, and so many people are out of work, figuring out how to allocate resources in the economy to their best efficient, best use in this new post-epidemic world is going to take some figuring out to do. So it's going to be like a kind of shallow U sort of looking recovery. That's my expectation. But as long as we are prisoners in our own home, it's going to be flat. Any other questions? Joint and several liability. Okay. So joint liability means that people involved in a crime or in damages, they are all. So joint and several liability is a phrase that applies to everything. So say you have multiple people. Say there's a river. This is a river. And then you have a guy, a house down here, normal guy. And then you have 3 factories that opened up at the same time. And all 3 factories are now dumping their pollution into this river. Some factories are dumping way more than others. But when this guy comes, when it's time for him to sue these factories, he'll sue all of them. And all of these factories will have the same liability jointly, and they'll be individually responsible for paying it separately. So another way of thinking about joint and several liability is combined responsibility and individual responsibility as well. I hope I don't graduate university during a recession. Yes, that would be bad. There's actually a lot of research on people who graduate university during a recession. A guy at the University of Toronto is probably the world's leading expert on this. His name is Philip Oreopoulos. I think I spelled that correctly. Could be OUS at the bottom. Let me just double check. I got that right. So Oreopoulos, he's done a lot of research on students who graduate during recessions, and he's pretty much the world leading expert. You just Google his name and recession. You can see some of his research, and the findings are not good. But most of you guys, I think, are in first year, so you should be fine. Hopefully, all this will be over in 3 years. Any other questions? Do 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 do. Questions. Here we go. Has the lower recent price in oil also contributed to the recent rapid decrease in our economy? Well, it's not. So here's. Okay, this is an important question. Are low oil prices bad? Okay? How are prices determined? You should know by now that a price is determined not because of just one person doing something. Price is always supply and demand. There are two sides for any price determination process, right? So prices, if you just say that prices are down, therefore it's good, or therefore it's bad, you're missing at least half the equation. You have to understand why a price is down. Well, prices are down for oil for two reasons. So initially we had, let's keep it on this graph. Initially, demand fell a lot, right? Because of the recession, you're not allowed to, because of the pandemic, you're not allowed to leave your house. You can't go out shopping. Well, you can basically only go out shopping. You can't go on vacations. You can't fly anywhere. Businesses are closing down. They don't need to order things being shipped to them or sent by delivery trucks, etc. So there was a huge decrease in the demand for oil. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia and Russia, who are two very large oil producers, they got into a big disagreement over oil. And so Saudi Arabia increased their supply of oil as well. So we got this huge drop in oil prices. Okay? And this huge drop in oil prices is bad for high cost oil manufacturers, for example, or oil producers, sorry. For example, the oil sands in Alberta, who are only profitable when oil prices are much higher than they are now, and they're selling their oil at very low prices, and pretty soon they'll be selling it at effectively negative prices, where shipping the oil out of the factory will cost more than the price of the gallon of oil. So that's a thing that's happened. So it's not good for oil producers, especially for marginal high cost oil producers. But on the other hand, for consumers who've lost their jobs but still need to go around to do their shopping, etc., uh, they the low oil prices are a pretty good boon for them. At the same time, if you're a business and you still need to do some shipping, but the number of customers has shrunk, having lower oil costs or petroleum costs, that's going to be a little bit of a benefit to you as well. So when prices change, there are always some who benefit and some who lose. But low prices, you should always think of as a benefit for consumers, and especially in a time when consumers are losing their jobs or having major declines in their income, lower prices should be seen as a good thing, as a really good thing. Because there are more suppliers, or sorry, there are more consumers than there are producers, and everyone is a consumer. Okay, everyone is a consumer, and so everyone benefits from low prices overall. But only if these low prices were determined by a supply and demand equilibrium. If you had low prices, if you try to achieve low prices through price ceilings, and remember, a price ceiling is a price that it's illegal to go above, then we have shortages, where producers will simply not provide enough for consumers, and so consumers will go hungry, because even though they have the money to pay the price, there's just not enough to buy, and producers do not have enough incentives to produce more. Regarding this situation, there is actually an interesting article in the Financial Times, FT for Financial Times, on the game theory for, let me pull that up in the chat right now, actually, on the game theory of the oil situation. Here we go. Here is so the article talks about they interview not actually economists, they interview mathematicians, because game theory is mostly a subfield of mathematics that economists have gotten to use, and I personally am a little skeptical of most applications of game theory. So the argument the article is making is that Saudi Arabia actually has an incentive to increase production during this time of low demand. Why? It's because they say some advanced highfalutin game theory where if you produce a lot now, you're driving your competitors, your high-cost competitors, out of business, so that when prices go back up again, the competitors, because they've gone out of business, you can buy their products, etc. It's basically an effort of it's a mathematical game theory approach to predatory pricing, where they're trying to sell. Saudi Arabia is trying to sell at very, very low prices because they can, and hopefully to drive out their competitors, so that when prices go back up, they will have more of a market share for a longer period of time than they would have otherwise. I recommend you read that article, see the mathematical explanation, and try to think whether you can just apply basic economic concepts to come to the same conclusion, make the same arguments. So, do you think there's solid opportunities to make some money off our current situation? What would you expect to increase in quantity demanded for people in quarantine, other than food and home entertainment? So, there are definitely opportunities to make money. Lots of people are making money. but food and entertainment are definitely the areas right now that are making the most money, especially home deliveries of those things. And if I had a better idea of how to serve consumer needs during this quarantine, I'll probably be out there making those investments personally. But I, like most people, don't know what the future is going to be like, because right now a lot of people have seen reductions in their income, but not everybody. Okay, this is the important thing to know, that in recessions, not everyone is affected equally. Some people are see their incomes go up, right? So I think I mentioned this in a lecture where there was a effectively a hedge fund based in Florida, that in March, when the Dow Jones was down 30-40%, this hedge fund was up 3,600%, right? And there were other companies that were up much higher than that. So it's always possible to make money in a time when most people are not making money. And the reason most people aren't making money most of the time is because we don't know what people need and how to allocate resources efficiently. And so if you have a good idea on how to allocate resources efficiently, and remember, efficiently means a way of providing them to consumer that satisfy consumer preferences in the present, then you can make a lot of money. A recession is not a sentence where you have to serve a minimum period of time. It's just there has to be some time passed because we had false information before. Now we have to figure out what the truth is. So if you know what the truth is, then you can make a lot of money. So aside from what you're explaining now, what are some of the concepts that you would recommend going over? If you can go over the first couple of weeks when it comes to constitutions, policy making, decision making processes in groups, etc. I think those are really, really key insights to have when it comes to understanding the world, especially when it comes to understanding the government and how decisions are made in the government. And I expect most of you guys in the environmental science program to either work for the government or work for an agency who is hired by the government, or you do a lot of work with the government. And so those early readings give a lot of insight, plus the Ostrom reading from a couple of weeks ago. They give a lot of insight to how the world really works when it comes to government decision making. And as the role of government gets bigger in society, understanding it will make life a lot easier, I think, for you, and how to make decisions, make life choices, make even career choices as well. Stock market prices have already been slowly rising since the crash. Do you really think it's going to take years to get back to normal? Again, the stock market and the real economy are only connected to each other in the loosest sense, right? So the stock prices are impacted a lot by how much money people have in order to buy stocks, and a lot of that money right now comes from the central banks basically paying financial institutions to buy stocks and buy bonds, etc. And so that's going to increase stock prices, but that's not going to have at least very immediate impacts on normal people's ability to find a job, to have an increase in their income, to make more goods and services. So that's definitely going to take a lot longer than the market for stocks and bonds and other financial instruments to rebound. How are non-rival, rival, and excludable, non-excludable goods related? Okay, so there is two ways. So when it comes to a good, and a good is just anything that people want to buy, okay? You can categorize goods into two things. They're either rivalrous or excludable. Excludable. So rivalrous, yes, or I'm going to do this symbol for not rivalrous, and then excludable, and then this weird squiggly for not excludable. Okay? So what is an example of a good that is both rivalrous and excludable? That's most goods, most physical goods like potatoes or pens, right? I don't know, phones. Okay? It's rivalrous and excludable. If I have a phone, it's rivalrous. That means if I'm using it, it's decreasing in value over the longer I use it, right? Because it gets wear and tear. I can break it, etc. So it can break and it can lose its value, but because it's being consumed or breaking, etc. And it is excludable because I can put it in my pocket or put it in a safe deposit box and no one can get access to it. So I'm excluding others from using it. Something that's excludable but non-rivalrous, this is a club. So membership in a club is technically non-rivalrous. Technically, you can have a club that includes all the people in the world as members, right? But as the old saying goes, would you really want to be a club? Would you want to be a member of a club that would have you as a member, right? It's excludable though. Membership is excludable because you can say, you can limit who's allowed to be in your club based on some arbitrary criteria. No homers. We're only allowing one homer for a club. So that's something that's excludable but not rivalrous is a club. Something that's rivalrous but not excludable, those are common pool resources. Those are like fishing out in the ocean. Legally, no one is allowed to own the ocean, even though technically it's possible for you to put a fence around a part of the ocean and then stop both other fish from swimming in and out and stop other boats from crossing that line. Theoretically, that's possible, but we don't do it. It's also theoretically possible to draw imaginary lines and have legal ownership that way, just like we do on land. For example, when it comes to, we talked about the Native Americans in the southwest of the United States. They had property rights for roaming from migratory species. They figured that out just fine. Common pool resources, it's impossible to exclude them for whatever reason, legal or physical, but they're still rivalrous. For example, the fish, if there's only 1 million fish, if I take one fish, that's one less fish for everyone else to consume and enjoy. And then there are non-rival, non-excludable goods. We call these public goods. And public goods, this is different from a good that's publicly enjoyable, and this is also different from a good that's owned by the government. So the government owns some things, some land, and then sometimes people call those public goods, but that's not accurate from an economic point of view. So you have a public good. It has to be in economics. It has to be both non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Which the one thing that everybody agrees on is information. Information is non-rivalrous and non-excludable because if I have the idea 2 + 2 = 4 in my mind, and you have the idea 2 + 2 = 4 in your mind, I can't stop you from thinking that, and because you are also thinking the same thing as I am, that's not actually changing the idea in my mind at all. So that's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Other examples people like to talk about are armies, parks, traffic, etc. But we have lots of counterexamples to those where something is either rivalrous or excludable in that situation. When Microsoft and other companies who can sell product services at losses to drive out of competition, is that predatory pricing? Isn't that illegal? Predatory pricing is illegal, but predatory pricing is so vague as a concept. So I told you the joke before, 3 people are in prison, okay? So we have 3 people in prison. P1, P2, P3. And then the first guy says, everybody asks each other, why are you in prison? And the first guy says, my prices were greater than the prices for my competitors. And so they accuse me of price gouging. My prices were bigger than my competitors' prices. Price gouging, that's illegal. This guy comes in and says, my prices were lower than my competitors. They arrested me for predatory pricing. Predatory pricing, which is also illegal. The third prisoner says, my prices were the same as my competitors. This was also illegal. They call this collusion. You all colluded in order to have the same prices. So this is clearly ridiculous. And so courts recognize this, and there was a trend over the last couple of decades to stop worrying about these kinds of pricing schemes, people charging too much or too little or charging the same. Courts stopped caring about this. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of pushback and to try to make this, bring back these distinctions in order to throw more people in jail or break up companies, etc. In my view, this is all competition. This is all business. Predatory pricing, just to take an example, is not a death sentence for businesses. You can be smart about predatory pricing. And I've mentioned this before in class, is the history of Dow Chemical. Dow Chemical, right now, is a gigantic global chemical, petrochemical firm, but they weren't always this big. And in the early 20th century, Dow Chemical had lower prices, and the big chemical companies in the world were based out in Germany. And the German manufacturers said, do not come to Europe and sell your low-priced chemicals, or we will retaliate and sell our prices and sell our chemicals at a much lower price than you can afford to produce that. You're much smaller than us. We will undercut you. We will sell at a loss because we can afford it. And Dow said, bring it on. I don't care. So the Germans went out and did sell things at below cost, right? And they were driving Dow they were out competing Dow in Europe. But Dow was smarter than this. So he bought the low-cost German chemicals in Europe, and he shipped them back over to the United States and sold them for a profit in the United States. So you can make money based on predatory pricing as a business. One second. All right. Any other questions? Oh, quite a few. Can price ceilings go above the equilibrium? If you have a price ceiling above the equilibrium, it is effectively worthless as a price ceiling because no one has an incentive to sell above the equilibrium price anyway. It's the same story if you set a price floor below the equilibrium. Nobody has an incentive to sell below the equilibrium anyway. Price ceilings are only effective if they are below the equilibrium, and price floors are only effective if they are set above the equilibrium. Gotta remember that there's already been some bailouts. Yep, there's been lots of bailouts. The stock market improved as a result, but it's not like actual economic activities have been increasing. Exactly. Does a shift in supply directly affect the demand, or is it quantity demanded that's affected, and vice versa? This is a good question because a lot of people are confused about this same topic. A lot of mainstream press is also confused. Remember, so here we go. So we're drawing supply and demand, price, quantity. And remember, supply is the direct relationship between price and quantity supplied, and demand is the indirect relationship, the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. When there's an increase in supply, this is an increase in supply, demand, which is to say the relationship between price and quantity demanded, has not changed. However, the quantity demanded has changed. So this was the original quantity demanded, and this is the new quantity demanded, which is at equilibrium is going to equal the new quantity supplied, and previously it was also equal to the quantity supplied. I'll make this prime. This is the original and original. Okay? Once the lockdown is lifted, people who still have money from not spending the government handouts will be spending again, and even though some people will be affected in terms of finding employment again, other sectors that are more in demand after lockdown will employ people and help increase GDP. Yes, this is definitely true, but the question is which industries will see this increase in demand? What will people buy after they come out of lockdown? Will they rush to restaurants? What if the restaurants are still closed, right? A lot of restaurants might have gone out of business because they might still owe rents that they couldn't pay anymore, or other loans, etc., that they couldn't pay anymore, or maybe they own their whole building and they can't pay the insurance on the building, etc. So lots of businesses could go out of business, and it'll still take time to figure out for consumers where to spend their new money on. So anything that's going to be in business after the lockdowns are lifted, they're going to see a huge surge in activity, but people might still be keeping hold of their savings until more businesses come back online, just because they might not be happy with the choices that they'll have after lockdown. I believe people will still be hesitant to go out at the start, and certain industries like vacations and cruises will probably be hurt at the beginning. Yeah, that's also true. So just because the lockdowns have been lifted officially doesn't mean that people will be going out voluntarily anyway. So it might still be. So even if, for example, people say right now schools are technically, elementary schools and high schools, they're technically supposed to go until the end of June. But if they remove the lockdowns next week, how many parents will send their kids back out to school, right? So especially if the parents are still at home and they don't trust how clean the schools are, etc. So just because the lockdown has been lifted doesn't mean that people are going to be resuming economic activity as normal at the same rate instantly anyway. So the situation could be complicated for a long time, even after the lockdowns have been lifted. So does quantity demanded always equal quantity supplied in equilibrium? Yes, that is the definition of equilibrium. The definition of equilibrium is quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Only if we are for some reason out of equilibrium, for example, if there is a price floor or price ceiling that legally makes it impossible for there to be an equilibrium, then you will have quantity supplied that will not equal to quantity demanded, and then you can end up with shortages or surpluses depending on where the price control is, above or below the equilibrium. Understanding supply and demand. If you leave this course with nothing more than understanding supply and demand, you will be in such a better position to understand just the world, really. So if you guys can really master just drawing a supply and demand graph and being able to label it correctly and being able to work out whether a change in policy or economic factors is going to be a shift of the supply curve or a shift of the demand curve, and then how that's going to impact prices and quantities, you can make a lot of good decisions that way. So if you have any questions, any confusions at all about supply and demand, please let me know now. So the questions so far have been really good. So any other questions, throw them at me. Why you so smart? I'm not that smart. I just know more than you guys. I've been just studying economics for more than 10 years. So I just know a lot more than you guys. You can know as much as me. You just have to study just as long as I'd have. Can you go over the minimum wage problem of supply and demand? I can go over the supply and demand of the minimum wage easily, because we've gone over it 100 times before. Well, not 100 times. We've gone over it a couple of times before in class. Let me make it big so it's easier to see. You have demand, you have supply. Okay? The supply of workers, laborers, we call these workers, right? The equilibrium price we call the wage when it comes to the labor market. And then the equilibrium quantity, we call this employment, right? If there is a minimum wage, is a minimum wage a price floor or a price ceiling? What do you think, Quinn? A minimum wage, is that a price floor or a price ceiling? A price floor would mean that it's illegal to sell below that price. A minimum wage makes it illegal to hire someone below a certain price. So it is a price floor. So it's a price floor, which means it's going to be above the equilibrium. If it's above the equilibrium, that means the quantity of employment demanded is going to be much lower than the quantity of employment supplied. And when there's more supply than there is demand, we call this unemployment. Okay? So this is the very, very basics of the supply and demand for labor. Okay, you have to take some things into consideration. First of all, that not all wages in the economy are the same. For example, working in a supermarket, the wage for someone who works in a supermarket is not the same wage as someone who is a rocket scientist, right? Or a computer engineer. So different markets have different prices. And when you set a universal low price, that means that the people who are making the lowest amounts in the economy, they're going to be hurt disproportionately more than everyone else. So there's going to be a lot of unemployment for low income workers in the economy. And who tends to be low income? Well, sorry, low wage. So how are wages determined? Supply and demand. What determines demand for workers? Okay, demand for workers is the same thing as any other demand. It's someone's willingness and ability to pay workers. Willingness and ability to pay workers. Who is willing to hire someone? You have to be a business basically to hire someone, but not always. For example, in a lot of countries where there is no minimum wage, people hire live-in nannies, or even not live-in nannies, but they hire house cleaners, etc. Just normal, ordinary people, middle-class people. They can afford to hire nannies and caretakers and maids, etc., to come clean their house. They're not businesses, they're normal salary workers, but they can afford the low wages required to do this. The ability, you also need the income. So what determines the willingness and ability of someone to hire someone? They have to be making money, right? So if a business, the wage, the equilibrium wage, is in some sense determined by the income of the employers, okay? And the income of the employer is also determined in part by the employees that it can hire. The more employees a landscaping company can hire, then the more money it can make, right? So it gets a bit more complicated from there. There's a question here. Could you theoretically have a $0 wage job, but it would have no demand? There would be lots of demand for a $0 a wage job, but there might not be any supply. But we do know that there's definitely a supply for zero wage jobs. They're called internships, right? There's also the situation of negative wage jobs. So I live close to a golf course, and in the summertime, during the golfing season, and there's a golf tournament here with big name players showing up, the golf course will say, come volunteer for us, but we will only take volunteers who will donate some money to the course, right? So that's effectively a negative wage job. So volunteer is zero wages. There's negative wage where you pay in order to volunteer somewhere. So those are really prestigious jobs. They will actually ask you to pay money. If also the supply also allows for it. If people are lining up to work for free, then it only makes sense for the people to say, hey, if we don't need so many people, we'll take the ones who will pay the most to work here, actually. If you go back to the lectures from the semester, I had a whole video that was talking about minimum wages by my old graduate school professor, Walter Williams. Walter Williams. He has a documentary out. He's African American, and he talks about the history of unemployment and its effect on the African American communities. This was back in the 80s. And he likes to point out that in the 1940s, the wage of a black teenager and a white, or sorry, the unemployment rate among black teenagers and white teenagers was identical. But today, after the minimum wage, and the minimum wage came out into effect in the second half of the century, after the minimum wage, that's when the unemployment rates between black youths and teenagers started diverging a lot from their white counterparts. And one reason you can one thing you can do is think about why that would be the case. Why would the minimum wage affect different people in society who supposedly had the same skills? What would it affect them differently? Got time for one or two more questions. While you're thinking of a question, here's something else you can think about. Is it possible for there to be no demand for employment? Is that even conceptually possible? What would that mean? What would a supply and demand graph look like for no demand for employment at some wage? Well, think of the supply and demand, what that would look like. So even if we lived in a world full of robots, but there were still people around, would there be infinite unemployment? Right? Just something to think about. That's actually one of the questions for the long answer questions. So I'm not going to answer that here. So just something to think about. All right, guys. Thank you for a great semester. I had a lot of fun teaching you guys. If you have any other questions, I do not teach anything else at Guelph, and this might actually be just the one and only semester I teach. So I was brought on because the typical professor who teaches this course is on sabbatical, and they were supposed to get another professor to teach, but last minute that fell through. So I was brought on as a last minute ringer to teach this class, and this has been really fun for me, and I hope you guys have learned a lot. And if you have any other questions before the exam, feel free to email me, and I will be happy to answer those questions. All right. On the exam day, I will also be live streaming on Twitch, and if you have any questions during the exam, just you can pop into Twitch and ask me then. Okay. All right, guys. Nice knowing you guys, and hopefully I will see you guys again because this was fun.